Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Coach's Corner University podcast. I am your host, Paul O'Need, and today I'm joined by perhaps the most intense person I've ever had the pleasure of shaking hands with, Cris Edmonds. Cris, thanks for being on the podcast, man.
Absolute pleasure, man. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, so we have, worked kind of in the same circles for a bit. Mutual friend Danny Lamartina, who is my coach, and you also help her and consult with her on her training. So I was familiar with you. I have never done this before, but before we start, I do need to extend a fuck you for the Cris Pause set. That is the worst, the worst thing I have ever experienced in the best way.
Right?
Um, so for our audience,
Yes.
I feel like introducing what a Cris Pause set would be a phenomenal introduction to you as a
Oh,
person.
heck yeah. Yeah, because that embodies everything in my way I attack life. Whether that's business, relationships, friendships, training, doesn't matter. So if you guys are familiar with I come from a background of loving Dante Trudell stuff, right? And reading about it. And so his original rest pause. So to me, what you want to think about is you pick a weight that you fail somewhere around 10 to 12, maybe 15 with, and you just take it to the end. And then you take 20 deep breaths or 10 deep breaths, I guess, essentially 20-ish seconds, and you go again. You take 20 seconds, go again. And then, I would get to the end of those. And sometimes, even though going as hard as I could for as many reps as I could, I was like, I feel like there's some stuff left in the tank that I can get to.
Yep.
Which at the end of the day, when I think about training, and if you can't tell, I get really fired up when I speak about it. I'm always trying to search for new areas of pain that I've never discovered. And I think sadly, so many individuals they're like, "Oh, I'm the hardest worker. You can't do a set harder than that." And I guess I'm of the mindset unless a set puts me in the ground 6 feet under, there's more to be found and more to be experienced. And I heard of an analogy once where it said, we may reach what we view as a pinnacle of a mountaintop, but then we look up and it's like, oh, there's another peak we haven't even reached yet.
Yep.
And that's always the way I felt about training. So, anyways, to get back to your original question instead of a philosophy answer. So once you do those three mini sets to failure, what you want to do is you want to cut that load by anywhere between 30 and 50%, and you just crank 20, just piston style. The goal there is just massive lactic acid. And then after you do that, you stay with that same weight, or you can drop it down a little bit depending upon where you're going to do the iso hold. But you want to hit an iso hold for roughly 30 to 60 seconds. So I'm not going to credit me for iso holds. John taught them to me, who he learned from Tom Platz. So another young idol of mine when I was a younger kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with an iso hold, that can be a multitude of locations, right? That if you're doing a lat pull down, you could have that in the contracted position, you could have it in the stretch position, or you could have it in the mid range. Um, so what I want to do is I just want to find an iso hold position, get there, and just see how long I can tolerate that pain. And usually it somewhere falls between 30 and 60 seconds.
So the cool thing about that type of intervention, which I think a lot of people will miss, and I love that you worked in your philosophy on training because honestly, it really resonates with me. But when Danny introduced me to that, I was like, all right, this is gonna fucking suck.
Yep.
It ended up, I did it on a squat, like a Cybex squat press,
Oh, God, yes.
and I remember I undershot the load a little bit. So my first set was 19,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
I got 11, and then 7, and then I ended up getting 31 on the but she tempoed it. So it was like a
Yeah.
3-second tempo, 3-second pause. And I got 30 reps, and then the ISO hold it almost put me in the ground.
Yes.
Uh, but why it was implemented for me is because positional tolerance was something that I was struggling with knee pain. So it forced me to use lighter weights, and it got me to perform ISO holds, which are fantastic for tendinopathies and doing it in a fatigued state. So I think that blend of, insanity with intelligence is the hallmark of a great coach.
Correct.
So
Yes. Agreed.
very, very cool.
I always try
Um,
to tell people somewhere between dumb meathead and then John showed me all the science stuff. I tend to fall towards dumb meathead, but Uh, that's there's periods of time to me in everyone's training or workout, however you want to look at that, where I think you just have to turn your brain off and just go.
Yep.
And that's what that set forces you to do. Because if you start getting overcritical and overthinking, you're not going to be able to accomplish what I want out of it.
Yep. For sure. The way you describe the mentality around it reminded
Yep.
me of. Are you familiar with who Buddy Morris is?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So Buddy Morris was the mentor to one of my mentors, and we went to go see Buddy speak. And he was talking about training intensity with regards to like conditioning drills.
Mhm.
And he was like, "Listen, motherfuckers, you're gonna puke before you pass out. You're gonna pass out before you die. You haven't puked
Yep.
yet. You haven't puked yet. So you got 2 more steps left. Keep going."
Correct. I've always thought this, right? Like our bodies are made to survive and endure. Brains will cut us off or protect us from that well before it happens, right?
Absolutely.
So I've, maybe I've listened to too much David Goggins, or maybe my early football coaches were like, "Man, like we ain't even close to suffering yet. Like we got more work to find." And like that to me is what training is all about, and that's why I love it so daggone much.
Yeah. I think if you can learn to endure through training, I think you can learn
Mhm.
to endure through most things in life.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I personally view training as a vehicle for exactly that, just
Mhm.
teaching me how to do hard things.
Correct.
How did this philosophy of yours kind of evolve over time?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I learned all of this through. I had a lot of great football coaches when I was younger, and they introduced me to weight training like the right way. They introduced me to pain tolerance in the right way, and I found very quickly on like through college and when I started working as a trainer, that was a very transferable skill. And I, like you were saying with training, like what that to me started out as me chasing football and then eventually running to the end of my football career into I had nothing to do with all my free time as a hobby, right? So I was like, I have to find something that replaces that sensation of like me catching a punt and someone trying to take my head off, like that adrenaline rush I needed. Um, so
That's the insanity part. Okay.
yeah. So we found that like training for football. So I was like, like let's see what this bodybuilding thing's all about. And then quickly I realized like with all things in life, because I think to side tangent you here, like if you view something like say a ice bath, you know, there's some people that say the science doesn't say the ice bath is going to either increase brown fat or it's not going to help you with recovery, right? But to me, the ice bath is similar to a hard set of training. Like if I can get in that tub up to my neck for 6 minutes and endure that pain, everything else in my life is simple. Um, like, and if we really want to go deep into like that realm of my brain, right? I grew up with a mother who had lupus and she was in chronic pain from the time I was about 10 until she passed in my mid 20s. And I always would try to come back to it. I'm like, man, like when I'm in the gym, when I'm in the football field, like I can control how long that pain lasts and it's going to be over. With her, it was chronic pain from the time she woke up to the time she went to bed. So I'm like, man, this stuff is easy. I'm choosing to squat till I can't stand up. I'm choosing to do hill sprints until it feels like my lungs are going to collapse. Where with her, it's like it's chronic pain, man. Like so, I always viewed it as a gift, as opposed to I think a lot of people view it as a punishment. When I write a hard set in there, I'm like, man, like I'm still fortunate at almost 40 to be able to go in the gym and torture myself to a point that makes most people say, "What in the world is going on over there?" And I view it as a gift because eventually that's going to be taken away from me, and I'm going
Yeah.
to have to replace that with something else.
Yeah. I mean, oh man, there's so much to pull from that. I look at training as like, especially when someone wants to train with me, I take it as a challenge. I'm like, can I put this person in the ground?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I'm pretty successful. There's a few
Yeah.
people in my life who like someone who comes to mind, Tyson Demaret, who's a friend of mine, a mentee of mine, trains at the same gym.
Right.
Dude is crazy. Like he's one of the
Yep.
only people who like actually scares me. Um,
Okay.
but we did a set. He just looked at me and goes, "Who hurt you?"
Right. Yeah. Yep. Agreed.
um, so let's get into a little bit because I think this conversation with you, I really want to get around X's and O's and I want to get around hypertrophy training because I think it is something that with this more evidence-based crowd, I've been of the mind, same as you, where you have to take the evidence and put it in context because that is something that we miss in a lot of cases. Case in point, this argument for RIR training. People will say, hey, training with RIR is just as effective as training to failure. Plus, you can do more volume, which we could argue whether that's good or bad. But most people have no concept of RIR because they've never
No,
trained to absolute failure. So it's kind of a moot point.
agreed.
How do you feel about reps in reserve, or how do you go about teaching intensity to your
Yeah.
clients?
All right, so I'm gonna start with a fun John Meadows story. And if
Love it.
anyone watching doesn't know who that is, I apologize. He's on my wall right here. He always watches over me. um, he was my mentor, coach, older brother, however you want to view that, for
Yeah.
over 12 years until he passed. And so we were tinkering around with reps in reserve because the literature backs it, right? Like in terms of scientific literature. So he had written a program called the Gauntlet, and it's for sale on our website if anybody's interested. Because I'm about to tear into it. um, and from early on, back into 2010s, I was product demoing his training. So before it got released, he would always have me run through it. And in this program, like I would say the first 2 weeks, I followed the reps in reserve as close as I could, right?
Right.
And I say as close as I could because who truly knows what 4 reps in the tank feels like? I know
Yeah.
what,
Very hard.
right. And I've always thought this: I either go to the end or I don't. And that blast or dust mindset is something that I think is very hard for someone like me who loves to find that to say, like, let's just, and for lack of better words, and this is going to sound like I'm talking shit, but I'm not, like, I'm going to stop where most people do when it starts to burn hard. Like,
Yep, I'm the same way for sure. I get it.
so, anyways, the first 2 weeks I followed it, and honestly, man, I just wasn't having fun. Like, I feel like I was in the gym going through the motions. And I looked at my training partner at the time and I was like, let's just screw this reps in reserve and go to the end on everything. And he's like, yeah, great idea, man. And
Good
we
training
quickly,
partner.
right? Yeah, exactly. We quickly learned within those next 10 weeks that our bodies were just decimated because the volume was so high. And, when you pair volume and frequency, the intensity piece has to be pulled back if you're going to do those first two successfully.
Agreed.
And so again, this goes back to my dumb meathead, like recovery, who cares? We'll figure it out. Eat more food, sleep more, rest more.
Yeah.
And we just couldn't out train it. We couldn't recover from that brutality over the course of the 70 days it took us to complete it. So to speak to that point, I know that in my mind, like for beginners, for intermediates, I think that's great. But I wouldn't structure it or frame it as saying reps in reserve because they're going to go to what their perceived end is.
Right.
So I think it's very effective, right? Because I think that's where I differ from a lot of coaches is I think beginner and intermediate need a lot of volume because they need practice.
Yep.
And that goes back to my football days, right? Like if I had to run a slant perfect, I didn't just do it twice and move on. I ran that thing 100 times a day until it was perfect. And then those next preceding weeks, I continued to run them and practice and refine that skill. So with me, like I really believe that beginners and intermediate, that type of training works very effectively because it's volume, it's frequency, it's practice. Where I think when you get into someone who has 5, 10 years of good hard training experience, that's when you can start to throttle that volume back and the frequency back because you're better at training. And you can get on your lower lat, you can get on your teardrop, you can get, on your rear delt and stay there and pin that muscle like with just rep, rep, rep. And that's why I think like so many people are missing of they think you either have to be progressive overload or you have to be like reps in reserve. And
Yep.
I think there's a spectrum there that we can work on based upon your training intelligence and maturity.
I totally agree. I've always looked at the training paradigm as something that is very malleable because,
Mm-hmm.
if
Yep.
we have frequency, intensity, and we have volume,
Mm-hmm.
well, if I drive up intensity, I'm likely going to have to bring either volume or frequency or both down.
Correct.
But if I'm younger, obviously higher recovery capacity, each repetition is not as damaging or intense. You kind of get to throttle these variables up and down, and each person is going to adapt a little bit differently.
Right.
Um, so you as the coach need to pay attention to that biofeedback and what the
Yes.
client is actually able to provide. When we're
Yep.
looking at this whole training paradigm from start to finish, I think
Mhm.
the motor learning aspect is something that is ignored for the most part
Yeah.
because people are afraid to overreach.
Yes. Agreed.
It's like it's gonna take weeks of training to overtrain.
Here's a thought. Let's see if you agree with this. The only way to know if you've overreached is if you've done it multiple times.
Agreed.
It,
Yeah, for
I,
sure.
like everyone's always says that they're so terrified of overtraining, but they've never overtrained. And I'm like, how do you know there just isn't more? Like, if the wall of overtraining is here,
Yeah.
how close are you to that bad boy? You one set, two sets, three sets a day from hitting it? Like, those are all things that I, really truly wonder about. And I think it goes back to the question I didn't answer that you asked me is how do I teach intensity to clients?
Yeah.
Is the easiest way in my mind to get people to learn that is hit intervals on a spin bike
Okay.
because you know one speed and you either pedal easy or you pedal as fast as your feet can go.
Right.
And if you give someone, let's say, 10 intervals at 15 seconds as hard as you go, 45 seconds recovery pace, and I'm saying, look, on that 15 seconds, I need you to pedal that bike as hard as you can move your feet and just dig, and I don't care how bad it burns. And then we do that for 10 reps or 10 rounds, however you view that. And then I'm like, okay, the way you produce effort for those 15 seconds, I need you to, that's what your work sets to feel like. And that's the easiest way outside of getting someone in person with me and then showing them the light, so to speak, to do that. So then we just have to replicate it.
Yeah. So it's just like a very safe way to expose them to that level of effort. I do
Another,
something.
oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say I was like I try to put them in the safest positions possible and allow them to fail. So the leg press is my favorite one because it's probably the
Yes.
scariest one to go to failure on.
Right.
You're going to eat your knees. But
Yep.
I'll say, hey, listen, do a couple reps with the sled. See where that sled stops in your bottom end. I want you to set the bump stop just below that spot, and I want you to go until the sled hits the bump stop.
Right.
And I want you to note when you wanted to stop versus when you actually failed.
Right. Yeah.
And usually it's probably like 10 reps in reserve
Agreed.
where people want to stop. Um,
Yep.
sorry, yeah, continue on with your thought.
So, the analogy I always use for a long time in person is like, imagine you're getting chased down the street by a tiger. How fast would you run? Like, or if someone steals your child, how fast are you running after them to get
Steals your
get them
child.
back? Yeah, like to me, again going back to football, like I learned that on a football field. If I run a go route and I want to score a touchdown, I have to run as fast as humanly possible. All right, cool. Now let's just take that and transfer that same skill into the weight room. So if I'm doing leg extensions, which again, as you said, like puts you in a safe spot, I can go until literally I can't move the weight stack off of itself. That's what I have to do. You just go until you can't move it one singular inch. And it's like, how'd that feel? Okay, cool. I need you to repeat that again. Like rest 2 minutes, do it again. Rest 2 minutes, do it again. And then each time your reps should get less because you're able to produce less force. But that pump is growing and it's reinforcing in your brain like what failure feels like. And then
Mhm.
you just need to find ways to produce that or reproduce that on other exercises.
So when you're going through this process with clients, how do you get them over that mental hurdle that they might be doing quote unquote too much?
It's a great question. Um, Typically, the closer I get them to that, their progress starts to go this way.
Yep. Yep.
So it becomes like this almost like addicting feeling or sensation of like, oh man, like the harder I take my steps, and as long as I'm hitting my meals and not being an idiot, meaning sleeping 2 hours a night, progress happens. And what is the catalyst or driver of that? And what I always try to show them is if your meals are constant and your sleep is constant and stress is relatively moderate to low in a normal life, if you're growing, the catalyst has to be training, right? It
I
obviously
love
can be gear, right? I mean, obviously I'm not an idiot, but for the most part, if that is also a constant, training has always been the biggest area I've looked at to think that's where the most progress can be made up if we can learn to refine that skill. And then once that skill is developed and ingrained in your body, we take that skill and then now we apply intensity. And once you marry those two things, I'm telling you, like anyone who's worked with me in person or anyone online that has found that destination, so to speak, they have grown like a weed. And it
one
doesn't
of my,
matter their age.
yeah, I totally agree. One of my favorite concepts that I speak on is this idea of like inside out autoregulation as opposed to outside in. So
Okay.
outside in autoregulation is what most people typically think about autoregulation. It's like I'm going to regulate my training up or down based on the circumstances of my life. But what most people miss is like the things in your life you have a lot of control over. You have
Yes.
a lot of control over how many hours you sleep, how many calories that you're eating, how much time you spend in, quiet reflection and getting
Yep.
parasympathetic during the day.
Yep.
So, what if you took extreme ownership over those variables so that you could maximize your training?
Correct.
How much better could you be? Obviously, as a coach, you're dealing with the training and the nutrition and the lifestyle of your athletes. What are some of the things maybe you get them to look at in terms of like, listen, I'm going to ask a lot of you within these four walls. This is what we need to focus on outside of them.
Right. So I will tell a quick story here.
Please.
My wife is a therapist by trade, right? And
Okay.
early on in the course of our relationship, we were I can't remember what even got us this subject, and I said, okay, cool. Like, why do you think that I have such a deep seated root and love for training? And she's like, do you want me to be honest with you? And I said, yeah. And she said, because despite all the chaos in your life, that's the one thing that's constant and you have total control over. Meaning what
Yeah.
goes into my mouth, how hard I can take a set, how many sets I will do properly, how much sleep I can get. And I was like, man, like that was a really like light bulb moment for me because I hadn't
Totally.
really realized that about myself because I was early 20s. I was like 23, 24.
Okay.
And she made me realize that really early on, and that what that did was I was like, man, like if I can get other people to realize the power in taking ownership and control of that singular thing in your life, and then again going back and like cross reflection amongst business, your own relationship with your kids, with your wife, with your girlfriend, whatever, and applying those same principles. If I do the right thing every day, something good has to happen eventually. Like
Yeah.
and like when I get people to try to come to terms with, let's say, for example, you come to me like, Chris, my quads are horrible. And I assess everything and they come to town with me and I train them in quads. And I realize that, for example, they aren't sniffing the level of reps they need to get to with the given weight. And it's because of this, not their legs.
Right.
So once I can show them the light, so to speak, and say, okay, hey, first of all, I believe in brutal honesty to the face. I don't know
For
any other
sure.
way to be.
Yep.
And like one, and I'll give you a good example. One of my really good guys came into town, and I looked at him. I was like, you have so much more left to give, and you just don't realize it. But Chris, and there's no buts. I'm telling you right now, man to man, you have more. You just must. And how I always say this when people come to train with me, and maybe you can use this. I always say, my singular goal with training is to find that pain as soon as possible. Like I'm searching for it, and I need to stay there as long as I can tolerate it.
Yeah.
Once you come to terms with that, and you realize that's my sole mission, like it makes everything else easy. It's like, okay, cool. I'm going to get on that muscle, and I'm going to find pain quick, and I want to stay there as long as I can. And maybe that's because, like, you I heard Arnold early on say, "Hey, when the muscle starts burning, that's when the progress begins." Like that,
Yeah.
or the set begins. I can't remember exactly what his wording was, but that always stuck with me. And I'm like, "Oh man!" Like when it starts getting excruciating, that's where growth lies. Like this is where new exploration, in terms of bigger and better tissue, comes from. And when I pair all of that with watching, like when I was a young kid, I was very impressionable with bodybuilding and Milo Sarchev doing all those crazy giant sets, right? And he was like screaming at his guys, like, we must find the pain, be one with the pain, run to the pain. Like that resonated with me so much for various reasons. where I was like, oh man, like there are other people out there who like this, as
Yeah.
opposed to, I think what's very cliche on the internet now is that whole like, the Bulgarian split squat of death is hell, or God, fuck my life. It's just so hard, and I'm like,
Oh God.
isn't that what we're here for? Like, I guess you and I are on a different planet.
That whole it's like the glorification of suffering.
Yes, yeah,
Whenever I hear someone like, "Oh man, I have to do this today." Again, it sounds cliche, but it's like, no, you have the privilege of doing that today. Like you have the privilege of showing up to the gym and challenging your metal, and
yeah,
finding out what you're made of. That is an absolute privilege. There are, and not to bring like, I hate using this comparison, but it's like there are a lot of people who would give their left nut to have that privilege, and glorifying the suffering of a contest prep and whatever. It's like my wife's been prepping for like almost a half of a year
mhm,
trying
yep,
to get her pro card. I haven't heard her once complain outside of when I ask her, "Hey, are you okay today?" And she'd be like, "No, it's not a good day for me today."
yep, great,
And I look at that, I'm like, that is suffering, and she's choosing to do it. She's embracing the process, and there's a lot of people out there who are doing that, and I think it's an important lesson to learn that finding that pain, being in that pain, you are going to become a better bodybuilder. You are
yes,
going to also become a better person.
yes. What's really interesting, and you touch on something there that's huge. I was, I think, 8 weeks out from my last show, and there was a group of kids in the squat. I say kids, early 20s in the squat rack, and they were bitching about the squats they had to do, like barbell.
Yeah.
And so my brother and I were filming for YouTube, and I didn't have any headphones on, so I heard it. And one of them just happened to look me right in the eyes, and I never forget. I looked at that guy and I said, "What I wouldn't trade to switch spots with you for one singular day."
Yeah.
And when I was 27, like barbell back squats is what I lived for. Like I loved it. Like John used to program that in me. Like we would do chain squats until we couldn't stand up, and like to this day, like that is my lift, and I love it, and I was good at it. And when I was 27, he was like, my spine is severely screwed up, um, to the point where that exercise is no longer a viable option for me
Right.
if I want to progress everywhere else. So he was like, Chris, you got to take it out of your program. And since 27, I haven't back squatted, but I've always thought like just to be able to unrack that, you hear those plates jiggle, the chains pile up on the ground, like the bar is bending, my buddy slaps you on the back, you see spots, like I miss that so much, and what I wouldn't give to just feel that for one more day with no negative back pain. So it's interesting.
That's exactly why I started working with Danny, because the whole reason I started bodybuilding in the first place is because I got to a point with powerlifting where I couldn't train the way I wanted to. My
Right.
my knee and my hip were just so bad that I couldn't do more than singles on the squat. And when I say singles, I actually mean single, like one set of one.
Right.
And then all my volume had to be unilateral. But I got with Danny. I'm like, I think I can make this happen again, but I need some help. I did a show. Luke Miller coached me for it. It was honestly the best decision I've ever made. I learned more about myself during that prep than I did in any scenario. For people who think bodybuilding is easier than powerlifting, it's a different kind of hard.
Right. Yeah.
I would equate it to the way I create the analogy is when you unrack a max back squat, everything in your body is telling you not to bend your knees.
Correct.
When you're bodybuilding in a contest prep, you have that same fight from your mind for every activity during the day. You're sitting in your car waiting to go inside. Like it took me 20 minutes to get out of my car and come back in the house. Like, so it's that level of friction with everything you do in your life. And that was honestly an adjustment for me moving into bodybuilding because taking a set to failure doesn't scare me.
Right.
I don't get scared for a set of pendulum squats. I don't get scared for a set of leg press. I unrack an 800-pound back squat. There's a lot of fear.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And I live for that fear. So, I'll be 37 this year. And I look at these kids in the gym, because we have a powerlifting section and a bodybuilding section, and I'm getting ready to compete for the first time in 3 years in powerlifting. And they're complaining back and forth. And all I think about, I think that same thing. I'm like, what I wouldn't give to be 27 again
Right. Yeah.
and chasing that first, I think I spotted my first 800 when I was 27. So I was like,
Right.
this is this is the best years of your life.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Do not take this for granted.
And I try to tell them, like, because the kid came to me afterwards, like, what do you mean by that? And I was like, if I would have known the last time I unracked 4 plates on my back with 5 chains and did a set of 20, that was the last time, I would have appreciated it a lot more.
Yeah.
Because you just assume that's always going to be there. You're always, at that time of my life, like when you feel invincible, you're like, well, I'm always going to be able to do this, right? Like, what do you mean that one day I'm not going to be able to do that? Like, and it's really interesting to think about that in retrospect, or hindsight, however you want to view that.
Well, okay. So how old are you now?
uh, I'll be 40 in October.
Okay. So here's the mental gymnastics that I'm doing right now. We start lifting weights because we want to find out how strong or how big or whatever that we can get. What if you found that?
Yeah, agreed.
That's like, so I'm like, in preparation for this competition, I know that this competition is like the shaking the rust off one,
Yeah,
but I'm like, what if I actually figured out how strong I could be? Am I going to be okay with that?
right. Yeah, oh yeah,
And in saying that, obviously, I don't know, like, do you still have competitive aspirations in bodybuilding? Like, do you still want to compete on stage in bodybuilding?
yeah, I do. Yep. So I'm for sure competing next year again. So yeah,
Okay. So when you, keeping in mind coach's mindset, what does competing mean to you now versus what did competing mean for you maybe 8, 10 years ago?
yeah, of course. I think I'll start here. Like when I started bodybuilding, I just, as you said, I wanted to get bigger and stronger, and I didn't care about. I had no desire to like put posing trunks on. I didn't even know what that was. Right? Like I saw guys in the magazines doing that, and that'll date my age. Obviously, I've already told you I was almost 40. Like, but I had no desire like to getting on stage and all that mess wasn't really even the thing. And I just knew that I hated the way that I looked, and I had to fix it. And to me, like bodybuilding just kind of tickled all those like facets of my brain that I loved, like where I could really hone in and be like, okay, cool. Like if I eat these 5 to 6 meals and if I train 5 days a week and find ways to get better at it, like I'm going to grow. And that's what happened. So fast forward to, I guess, what it meant for me to compete 8 years ago. Like I was still small for, I would say until I was like mid 30s,
Okay.
or what I would consider small. But I guess you have to realize, like at this point, I'd hung around John and his pros for a long time. So
Right.
my idea or maybe perception of small was different than most.
You're
You
what,
know,
like 270 right now?
I'm 260 right now. I'm pretty good shape. So, like it's one of those things where it's like I didn't really feel into this last prep I did in November that I was in a good spot of where if most people would see me, there's no question I'm a bodybuilder, right? Like where I think most others would probably say, "Ah, no, that's not true," or at least my lower body for the most part. So like now competing means to me is like I'm just trying to achieve a fraction of the look that John had on stage. Like that's what I'm chasing. Like everyone always, I know it's really popular and cliche to say pro cards and all that stuff, and like I never viewed that as a possibility for me.
Yeah.
And again, that's not what drives my ship when I train, because if it was, I'd have quit a long time ago. Um,
I want you to, dude, that right there to me is probably the most powerful thing that you said already, because I think so many people are so externally motivated for that pro card or that world record or whatever it might be that they miss the point. It's like, if you just keep getting better, there's no stop, there's no like ceiling to what you can achieve as long as you just keep focusing on getting better.
Agreed. Yeah, 100%. Like every day I wake up and I look forward to training. And I believe it or not, I know this, most people say this is crazy. I look forward to my diet meals. Like I don't care. Like I've eaten roughly the same food in terms of the type of food, just different volumes for the last decade. So at this point, that's just a part of my life, like brushing my teeth, taking the trash out, kissing my wife before I leave, right? Like it's just normal for me. So I don't view that as most I think do as a punishment. Like that's my life. Like that is fully it. And my release each day from training and I will say a little bit of this. Like I've been very guilty in the past early in my like bodybuilding and even as of recent as 2019 of training with a place of anger in my heart.
Oh, yeah.
And I would go there, and I was one of those people that used to view training as like therapy or fighting demons or all that cliche shit, right? But when my mom passed, when I was in the middle of a contest prep when my mom passed, and it was out of nowhere. Like she went to the hospital on a Monday, she was dead on Sunday.
Oh,
Um,
gee.
and I always tell people she died on Sunday. I trained legs Friday before her death on no sleep with three of my buddies, and I buried them. I trained back on the day we put her in the ground. Like I didn't miss a beat. I didn't miss 1 second of cardio. I didn't miss a meal. I was eating out of Tupperware at her funeral. Like, and I don't say that to say that I'm hardcore. Like that's how I coped with her passing.
Right.
And training was a place at that time in my life where I could get rid of it all. And then I eventually became numb to it. And then when John passed, I'd I'd just been up there and spent a week with him at his house training and helping him coach his boys for football and us just working on business strategies for a week. I got home on Saturday. He died on Sunday.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
And so I reverted right. I was in a contest prep. I was 3 weeks out from a show when he passed. And I tried to revert right back to those old habits of trying to bury it. And sadly, what I ended up finding is all that buried pain of my mom just resurfaced with him passing. And I didn't know how to handle everything that was being thrown at me from like an emotional standpoint, as well as now I have his entire business resting on my shoulders. And it was all that was overwhelming. So what I ended up doing that year was I competed locally, I competed at North Americans, and then I did another show locally. And it was just trying to stay in that prep to avoid all that emotion.
Of course. Yeah, for sure.
So again, as I went back to my wife's a therapist, and she was like you have to come to terms with this. And I went to her and I told her, and I was like, hey, like I used to be able to take myself in the gym and go in that void, as Dave Tate calls it, and
Yep.
just erase it. But what I was finding is it would still come back in the session. Like I couldn't get rid of it this time. So I had to, over the course of the last 2 years, revert the way that I viewed training. And now it's very much from a place of privilege and happiness. And this is a pleasure, and I get to do this.
Yep.
And I just simply got better in the last, I put on roughly like 19 pounds in 2 years,
Holy shit.
um, from 37 to 39. And I attribute it solely to that. I don't think I did anything drastically different with my food or with supplements. It was simply just removing that barrier in my brain and unlocked a whole new category of like where I could take my sets. Um, so I don't know for all the people out there, some people may not connect to that, but for me, that worked.
So, first off, I'm very selfish with this podcast. I use
Yeah.
it purely as a way to connect with the people that I'm talking to. So I'm like,
Mhm.
I just want to connect with cool people. And that
Yeah.
story really resonates with me. Very, very similar for myself. I mean, when I was competing at my best, I was just a very angry person. I had
Hmm. Yep.
a lot of anger, didn't know how to deal with my emotions. I would get very, very, very fired up.
Mhm.
Now I have a little bit of a I have more of like a routine to get into it, that mindset for the set, but
Right.
there's no anger.
Yeah. Right.
There's nothing. It's purely focus. And I
Yes.
totally agree with you. It's how we are able to frame our mindset around training to a way where we're grateful for it and we're actually present within it
Yes. Agree.
as opposed to using it to shield us from something.
Right. Yeah.
I've always hated when people say like, "Oh, training is my therapy."
Same.
I'm like, that's probably like if you're saying that, you probably need therapy, bro.
Yeah. I've said this for years, in the last couple of years at least. You don't need therapy. You need a therapist. Like, stop it. I don't know who you're fooling, man. Like, And I always tell them, like, I've been you. I know what it's like. I know I may not have went through the same trauma or, whatever
Of course, yeah,
hurt that that person had experienced. But I can tell you this: if you train at a place of negativity, your body's going to feel that.
100%.
Where, if and and I think sometimes people may see it on the outside, like if they looked in on me doing, say, a set and be like, man, that dude has to go to a dark place. And I used to.
Yeah,
But that what is now dark is now focused and driven on a very singular goal of what I started telling you about was just finding a new level of pain. And
yeah.
it's solely selfish on producing results so that I can teach it to somebody else. Like, yeah,
I love that. I'm gonna shift back to a bit more
yeah,
X's and O's because I think
please.
finding that level of pain is a really interesting topic because I think people associate that level of pain or that level of discomfort with load, right?
Yes,
It's like I have to go heavy, especially the progressive overload crowd. They're like,
agreed.
I have to go heavier.
Yeah,
What I've actually found, because I'm coming from powerlifting, where if I want to just move weight, I'll leg press 15 plates aside.
right.
But when I'm moving with intent,
Mhm.
I've found that my results have gotten better. Like my legs have grown probably 2 or 3 inches in the last 2 years,
Yep,
just by and my loads have been throttled probably in half.
correct. Yep.
That like, how do you teach your clients, or maybe it's like an education piece, but
Mhm.
how do you get them to realize that load is not the most important thing and they can find failure with lighter weights?
Yes. All right. So I always use this analogy, and it's not throwing shade at powerlifting or anyone who is really strong in the gym, but I always say, like, those guys that go in and they put 5, 6, 7 plates in a barbell squat, like, look at their legs and tell me what they look like.
Yep.
And then look at my legs in comparison, and I'm using half of the load they warm up with, and yet the tissue is there. Why? I'm not a genetic outlier. I'm not a freak. I don't smash supplements. What the difference is there is we can move a weight from A to B, and I can rip load. Like anyone I think who has any level of explosion, type A muscle fibers that can just really produce force well.
Yep.
Or the biggest thing that I think that most people take away after they train with me in person is the intent in which every rep is done and that I demand out of myself and you.
100%.
And what they realize really quickly is the load doesn't have to be as much because it can't be.
It can't. It literally
No,
can't be.
no. And when here's what I would say to people: we're going to get on a muscle and we're going to stay on it until it's done. And they're like, I don't think they grasp that until it happens. And they're like, okay, cool, my quads are non-functioning. Yeah, because you've actually trained them and you didn't think I need to put as much weight on the bar and get my hamstrings in it and get my lower back in it and get my glutes in it. No, we're getting on that quad and I'm going to milk every bit of power and force until it dies, and then we're gonna switch body parts, like, or the session's over.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That, no, I was gonna say the squat, the analogy between like the guy who squats a shit ton in the sides of the legs. That was me to a
Mhm.
T. Like I squatted 800 pounds. You look at me, you're like, that guy's walking around on champagne flutes, you know?
Right. Yeah.
But I could squat 800 pounds. So
Correct.
I had big butt. So I mean,
Yeah. Right.
a lot of glutes.
Right. Yes. 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 And I think that's really hard for people, at least when I say intermediate, I'm talking more of like intermediate mindset in the way they think, and they haven't evolved mentally enough yet to realize that so many believe that load transfers solely to growth and nothing else. And I think what's really interesting, I saw this years and years ago because I used to train in a gym as a trainer 15 hours a day. The amount of girls who were curling what I did, or the amount of guys with really small arms that were curling more than me, they didn't have the development. And I'm like, huh, like that dude has 50-pound dumbbells in his hands and his arms are 15 inches.
Right.
Something's not working. Why? Why can I get a 25-pound dumbbell, which is literally half the load he's using, and my pump is so big I'm stretching out a triple X shirt? Like, tell me, like, there's something in there that people are missing. And what I always tell people to do is, like, I want you to make that set as hard as humanly possible. Like, that's
Yep.
how the bodybuilder in me or my brain resonates with it. Is like, I'm not using the load as the tool. I'm making my intensity and focus the driver of growth. And Now, I mean, there's a downside of that, right? Because I think people hear me say that, and like, oh, Chris, I can use the pink dumbbells and do 100 reps. Okay, there's a fine line.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there is some gray area. Like, but for example, if I'm speaking hard numbers, like let's say I'm hack squatting, look, if I gun to my head to save my kid's life, I could probably do 8 plates on a hack squat for 8 reps, deep hamstring sitting on my calves, not locking out at the top. Or I can put 6 plates on there, control every inch of that motion, pause in the hole, use nothing but my quads to drive out of the hole and not lock out, and do 20. That set all day long will be more beneficial in my mind than the 8 plate for 8 where I'm just trying to move it A to B.
I think that also calls into question the cost of doing business, as I like to call it, right? So the cost of using these heavy loads is recovery. I think I've always been at them, and we can look at the research, and the research will say, that light set taken to 30, 40, 50 reps to failure is going to be more systemically fatiguing than that lower repetition, heavier set.
Correct.
But when we put it into practice, the orthopedic cost of doing business, and then also the like CNS cost of doing business of that level of arousal
Yes.
required,
Yep.
that's going to burn you out really quickly
Oh yeah.
too. So
Yep.
I personally found, and I still coach a number of powerlifters as well.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I taught them how to throttle back their accessories and treat them like a bodybuilder,
Right.
well, now there's so much more recovery capacity available for us to push those barbell lifts even harder.
1,000%. Yes.
Um, so let's shift gears
Yeah,
into the
please.
business side of things,
Yeah.
because I think the business side of things, especially when it comes to your journey, is really interesting to me because you partnered with John as a member of Mountain Dog.
Yes.
John passed away, like out of nowhere, and now you've been thrust into being the head coach of Mountain Dog Training.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how that transition went from a business perspective of obviously now you're running the show?
Right.
A lot changed.
Yeah. Yes. I'll first start out by saying that that was a total team effort between Mary, who is John's wife, um, our IT guy, his name's RJ, who helps me, and then I had a handful: Andrew Berry, Zach Trowbridge. Uh, that was just a few. Noah, the guy that used to film all of his YouTube videos. The collective group of us did a ton of work initially.
I mean,
Um,
even just you and Andrew Barry, that's two ridiculous minds, man.
right, right. So I start by saying it was a total team effort, but I would be lying if I said I didn't feel like the weight of that was on my shoulders.
Right.
And it's one of those things where I did not prepare for that. Was he preparing and breeding me for it? 100%. When I was up there talking with him, he had every desire and intention of going off and coaching high level football. And I don't know if a lot of people knew that. He talked about like toiling in politics and then quickly realized like that wasn't for him. And he got obsessed with football and started coaching. Well, he had been breeding me for 12 years to eventually take over that company. I didn't know it early on, but I did at the end. And so that was in my mind. It was fresh. But I was also in a contest prep, and we had a lot of things to manage because he still had a good amount of clients. So not only did I have to manage all of my client load, but also all of getting his clients either dispersed to other coaches or me taking them on, from answering questions to Q&As to our program sales, like all of that was now a priority for me where, it hadn't been in the past because I'd worked on with him specifically, like we had built programs together. Obviously did a ton of nutrition coaching for him. And then building like athlete programs and manuals and training manuals and all that kind of stuff. Like that's where we were really going with the business. So not only did I still have to do all those same responsibilities, now I had the added of all of his. So um, I go back to what we talked about early is I always thought if I could do a Widowmaker set of squats, man, I can figure this out.
Yeah.
Right?
Fair.
Like do the right thing, meaning treat people right,
Yeah.
live with integrity, and work hard. I knew I could figure it out. And that's what happened. I'm not saying I did everything right or perfect. I don't claim to be that guy, but I can tell you everything that I did was solely out of respect for him and to make as much money for his family as humanly possible. And I know in my heart, if the roles would have been reversed and I would have passed away, he would have done the exact same for my family. So that's the type of bond him and I had since I was early 20s. And I still carry that around very pridefully, right? Like,
Yeah.
I still contribute and help Mary make money off of that business. And it's something that I will be tasked with till I'm done or she's done. Because if I can help support his family and the two boys like all day long, for as much as he gave me in terms of knowledge and taking in a young kid who was teeny at the time, I don't know what he saw in me, but I will forever be grateful and try to pay that forward and be the person he was to our community.
I think that's really beautiful, man. And it's something I don't think you talk about gratitude, especially gratitude for a mentor, like
Mhm.
to be able to have been influenced by someone as incredible as John. I mean, one of my biggest regrets in my experiences with strength and conditioning was John and I have been in the same room a number of times, but I was always too nervous to say hi.
Right. Yeah.
And now I will never get the chance. Um, so obviously he's had a tremendous influence on you. I'm
Yeah.
wondering what is your how do you carry that torch? Like when you think about how can I build off of his legacy while also like let's not forget you're also trying to carve your own.
Right. Yeah.
How do
Agreed.
you do both of those things?
That's one of the things when he was still alive, we were working on with me, right? Like he would always be like, Chris, like, I don't want you to forever be in my shadow. Um,
I love that.
and that was huge and powerful for me because even though him and I shared a lot of the same ideologies, meaning like we had always seen eye to eye since day one of me reaching out to him. And I'll tell this story real fast because it really you don't know when things are going to impact your life, just simple actions. And with you saying you were in the same room but never reached out, like
Yeah.
I was a huge active member in that T Nation forum when him and Dave Tate and Shelby Starnes, all those guys were on there, and like Jim
Oh wow.
Windler, Paul Carter,
Yeah.
right? And under one of his leg videos and workouts, somebody commented in the forums about like essentially how that workout was a joke and blah, right? Well, John responded back and said, you know, if you think it's a joke, come join us at Elite FTS once. And the guy blew him off. And I put in the comments, I was like, hey, John, this is Chris. Like, I was one of his clients at the time. I was like, I'll gladly come to Elite and train with you and do legs. And he goes, cool. You want to be here Saturday? I said, yes, sir. I drove from Virginia to Ohio through a derecho with trees falling down. We trained the legs for 3 hours and I turned around and drove home. And that moment forever changed my life, right? Because we walk in there, we sit down at the table. I don't know if you've ever been to the old S4 in Ohio.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. You remember that like table that was just dead center in the middle of the room?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yep.
I'm sitting there, putting my shoes on. Dave Tate comes and sits beside me and he goes, I was young, I was 23. You gonna be ready for this? And I said, yes, sir. And I looked at John and I said, the only way I'm leaving here is in a fucking body bag. And I didn't look back. And for the next 3 hours, they tried to torture me. And I loved every second of it. And instantly they said, you're welcome back here anytime. And I always tell people, like, I don't know what made me respond with that message that day when I was at work, but I was like, shoot your shot, man. Worst case that
Shoot your
happens,
shot, dude.
right?
Yeah. Hell yeah.
The worst thing that happens is he doesn't respond or says no. So that moment right there singularly changed my life because then, like, I think, when you train legs with someone and they bang, like, it's a bond, it's a brotherhood. And you're like, man, like, he may be way smaller because he was 3 weeks out from Masters Nationals when I went up there. And I'd never seen somebody that freaky and like, that close in person. And, like, that moment forever changed my life because he knew that I was willing to go to the end. And you can't fake that shit. You just can't. And I think that's why so many of us like bond so quickly in that moment. It's because it's like the amount who can do that and replicate it over and over again and are happy to be there. Like I remember thinking, like, in the moment, like, Jesus Christ, how many people would love to trade places with me right now? Don't fuck this opportunity up.
Yeah. I think I think that in and of itself encompasses this idea of showing up as your authentic self.
Correct.
And I gave a talk at Swiss 2 years. So not this year when we met last year. And I started my talk by saying, if you're in this room, it's not because you love training. It's not because you enjoy learning about nutrition. It's not because you really like coaching. It's because you live it.
Correct. Yep.
And I think that because that's who I am and that's who you are.
Yep.
And it makes the fact that we get to wake up every day and coach our clients like the easiest fucking thing in the world. Talk to me about how you are a product of your product, because it's something like when I look at you and I look at the content that you put out and I look at the way that you're speaking and even just how fucking fired up you were when you just got on this call. We had technical difficulties. You got on the call, you're like, yo, I'm fucking ready. I'm like,
Yep.
okay, let's go. That like
Yeah.
is that something that you had to I'm gonna ask the question. I already know the answer,
Yep.
but like
Please.
showing up as your authentic self doesn't seem like something that's very hard for you.
No, but I didn't always have that skill. I'll be honest with you. I worked in a commercial gym where I made a very good living servicing what I would consider mostly general population wealthy people. And the owner group that I worked for very much would have hated the way my behavior is currently. The way I curse, the way I get fired up. Like, they don't want that. They want someone who shows up and is just like, I don't know if respectful is the right word, but just like more chill, maybe.
Wearing a collared shirt kind of guy.
Correct. Yeah. Like, they wanted someone to take care of the rich soccer moms, and I was good at that because I could get them results, right? And one of my buddies, who actually I hired to work under me when I was there after I became like the fitness manager and all that mess, he said, Chris, like, you're doing, because he knew who I was, like, as a person. Like, because we would go to a different gym to train, if that tells you anything. Like,
100%. That frames the conversation much better.
because we couldn't, I couldn't go in there and spit on the floor and scream scream like
Spit on
motherfucker.
the
And
floor.
right, like, listen, I like to bang my fucking head on the bar and have somebody slap me and there's chalk everywhere. Like, so that to me, like, that's lifting because I grew up in a football background, right? Like, I'm used to people like screaming and throwing shit and like all
Yep.
metal weights, and I'm not used to these like pretty fancy machines. Like, that's not how I grew up. Like, I watched way too many Branch Warren videos when I was younger. Like, that's what I think training is. Like, so he looked at me one day and he was like, Chris, you're shortchanging your clients because you aren't showing them who you really are. And he said, I really think there's a lot of power in that shit. He's like, people will resonate with how you are in life because you attack that shit. And I was like, oh, God, yes, yes.
Yep.
And it took me a good bit of years to like slowly get out of that mentality of I can either people please and do as I'm told, or I can live life on my terms. And I think my mom passing helped that because I realized like how fragile life is. And I was like, no more. I'm gonna be who I am, and if you love it, hell yeah. If you hate it, I don't give an absolute fuck. Like, and that's so tough for so many people, especially in the like landscape of the society we live in. And I think with you asked me about how do I like what do I want to pass on to my clients, and it's that like the amount of freedom that comes from knowing when I speak on the internet or to you face to face, like that's me 100% of the time.
You're
And
the same dude.
my wife will confirm it. And what I've always told people, I was like, I never have to remember what I say because it's always the truth.
You're I picture like I've never met your wife, never seen
Yeah.
her on the internet, but I picture her as like the polar opposite of you, like
Yes.
just a very calm, peaceful, like because you need that balance in the relationship, right?
Yep. She is absolutely everything I am not.
I
And
love it.
it's interesting because I think sometimes people say like opposites attract, or like or on the other side they'll say, oh, you have to have like a lot of similarities. And you know a lot of times she's my peace and she's my like voice of reason, and she's that person also that can get inside of my ass if I need it, you know? So it's like she has enough like this like little spice and nasty to her that her and I connect, and she gets where I'm coming from. Because sometimes like I realize that for some individuals I may be a touch too much and over the top, and I just need to like take a deep breath. But at the same time, like that vigor and the way I choose to attack life has always served me well in the
Yeah,
long run. So
I
yeah.
love that. Um, so I like to finish the
Yeah.
podcast with some random questions that have
Hmm.
nothing to do with anything that we talked about.
Please.
So we'll start off. Widowmaker set of squats. You in the gym by yourself. What song is in your headphones?
Oh my word.
Or do you
Um
even have headphones in?
in a perfect world, no headphones with a speaker at the gym's blaring.
Okay.
Um it's gonna be really close to like anything that is screaming at me, yelling emotion essentially. There's
Yeah.
also that like there's that Rocky song, Jesus Christ, where I'm trying to think of what it is. It's the one where he's in the ring fighting in Rocky 4. Like a lot of times I'll put that on and that just puts me in the right zone. There's also, truth be told, no it isn't. Here's what it is. Um if you guys go on YouTube and type in Branch Warren Last Man Standing,
Okay. I know
I
exactly what
I,
you're talking
I
about.
literally put that in my headphones in a contest prep, and I would just listen to it on repeat. That's the answer. It's
That's badass.
It's ridiculously. You just have to listen to it, and you don't even need to watch it. Like now, obviously, if you watch it, it's like one of those motivational videos. It's really powerful if you watch, but you don't need to. It's that powerful for me.
You're at a dinner table. You have five guests, dead or alive. Who are they?
Let's see. That's a great question. Five. Okay, I definitely want to sit there with Tom Brady. I want John to be back. Um, Dennis Rodman, because I'd love to know like that thought process of him. I want my wife to be there, and then I think it's the last one. Oh, word. That's a tough. Let's see. You know what? I want my brother to be there so he can experience it.
I love that. Do you crack an egg on a flat surface or the side of a or the corner of the pan?
I crack it on the corner of my granite countertop.
I love that you specified granite. You're like, yeah, motherfuckers, granite countertop.
It's got a crack. Yeah, you damn right.
The last question I have for you. If there was one person that you think I should interview on this podcast, who would it be? But the caveat is you have to help me get them on the podcast.
My buddy and client, David White, all day long.
Dave.
And I'll tell you why. Um, every time that him and I have trained together, from the very first session, it was like we trained together our entire life. And sadly, it's not always been like that with everyone.
Yeah.
And I remember like when he came into town, he'd been working with me for 4 years at the time, which now he's on year 7 with me. And I knew like through the internet, like watching his sets that he would send me, like he could get it. Um, but I told my brother, I was like, listen, he's going to be in town for 3 days, and I just want to film it all, and I want it to be like fly on the wall, like very much like Dorian Yates' Blood and Guts style, right? Like I'm like, this is just going to be an authentic training session. We trained back day one. He was throwing up in between sets of the third exercise, and he continued the entire session. He'd be laying flat on his back, puking vertically, and then it was his turn, he'd jump up and do a set, and it was right back to the trash can on the floor. Um, there's a yeah, that dude knows how to go to the end. He embodies everything that a client should be, meaning from day one when he was no one, he would give you guys some perspective. He started with me, his first show prep with me, he was 137 pounds on stage lean. This past weekend, he won the overall, and he was 223 pounds on stage
Holy fuck.
in 7 years. The dude from day one has not failed check-ins twice a week, every week, holidays, Christmas, his birthday, doesn't matter. He has never check in at something besides 100% compliance. And every time he's come in to train with me, he's done nothing but learn ways to go to deeper and deeper sets of pain. Um, and everyone always wants to know, like, if they see me post this shit, like, they're always like, "What's he doing?" I'm like, "Everything right," and he listens and he does everything I could ever ask of him. I think you guys will get along great because him and I get along great. Like, the reason him and I
Yeah.
started doing a podcast together is because, like, we were just riding around at North Americans, and I was like, man, like, I think people would love to know what you and I talk about in terms of how to be better at bodybuilding. And that's why we started recording videos. And I told him, I don't care if 3 people watch it. If someone can learn from the things, silly things that you and I deem a necessity, like, that's what it is. So yeah,
That's honestly, that's why I started the podcast. I'm like, I don't care if anyone listens. I just want to have cool conversations with cool people.
damn right. Yeah,
I love
and
it.
that's what makes this lifting world amazing, right? Like, I think where sometimes we can get in this thing, like, where you walk into a new gym and clearly we're at the point now where, like, everyone will look at you and it's like, I hate the fact that if, like, another big guy sees you and glares at you, it's like, dude, like, I'm here trying to do the same shit you are. Like,
Yeah.
like, I'm not mad at you. I don't want to fight you. Like, stop this nonsense. Like, I'm sure you have some really cool stories, and we could get along great if you just removed that ego and said, "Hey, like, welcome. Let me show you what the machines that are great in here are. Or they aren't." Like, it's really interesting because I don't know why we are that way. Like, I'm not in here competing against you, man. Like, I've always felt, especially with bodybuilding, there's no defense, right? Like, I can't make you
Yeah.
eat shit food. I can't make you train like a pussy. Like, I can only focus on me. So I've never been threatened by another individual.
Right.
You may come in looking enormous, and I'll take it in like, damn, that dude's fucking stacked. And I think, like, anyone that has the level of muscle tissue that's noticeable had to earn it, and it wasn't easy. And he went through, or she went through, countless hours of sacrifice to get here. So can we just acknowledge that and move forward and be friends?
I love that. It's a fantastic way to end the podcast. Cris, I can't thank you enough for joining me, man. This is a really great conversation and one that I hope that we could have again in the future. So
Of course.
thank you so much. If there's anything else that you'd like to say before we hop off, like any message for the audience or anything like that?
You know, I really appreciate you having me on, Paul. And I think I'm just going to go back to what you and I just talked about is, you know, I think a lot of times people get so distracted by the end result. And if we just focus on day to day action goals and action items that are within our power. So if you think about fasted cardio, 6 meals, training session, you have 12 sets, 15 sets, however many sets you do, make every one of those things as perfect as possible. And then just do Groundhog Day. You will be surprised at what you can do with your physique, or if you apply that same analogy to business or your relationship with your wife, girlfriend, whatever. Like, that's how I've always been remotely successful in my life, and I really encourage everyone out there to just do.
I love it. I love it. Cris, thank you so much. I'll have links to where everyone can find Cris in the show notes.
Perfect.
Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and we'll catch you on the next one.